Andy Bohannon, Parks Recreation Facilities Director, and that's the only title I have here tonight, so based on last. This is kind of a tag team effort between myself and Don Lucier, our city engineer, who has been working on this project with us, trying to work towards the funding aspect of the Transportation Heritage Trail. Tonight we have two donations towards the city's match towards our grants. We have a donation of $40,000 from Pathways from Keene and $12,000 from the Monadnock Conservancy. And both of these organizations have come through for us in the past in the last two rail trail projects, and they continue to make that effort to make our trail system a viable place for Keene, and the vibrancy of people getting here and moving around and coming into our downtown and experiencing that economic development that we talked about with the UNH downtown study. This particular section of the trail will go from Eastern Ave to 101, and that'll be the next phase before we get to the bridges. I should let you know that even though we're getting the money now, part of this is in response to making sure that we have the match for these particular grants that we're about to receive. We have received the $386,400 from the congressionally directed spending from Congresswoman Custer's office, and we have looking to receive the Transportation Alternative Program, the TAP grant, for $644,100. The project itself would not kick off until about FY25, but we need to have all of our funding. And the reason for that is because we've received these two grants, the funding matchup in the years that we're being awarded isn't quite in sync yet, so we're working with the state office to align those. But, before us, we have just the match that we need for our city to reduce our match, and which is we're thankful for those community partners. I have both Ted McGreer from Pathways from Keene here tonight and Ryan Owens from the Monadnock Conservancy, who I know both would like to share a few words.
Thanks, Andy. Ted McGreer, 115 Main Street in Keene. On behalf of Pathways for Keene and numerous runners and walkers that come out July 4th every year and brave the heat, local businesses who are major sponsors of this event, we raise about $40,000 to $50,000 every single year. Pathways for Keene, as many of you may or may not know, is a 100% volunteer organization. And we are thrilled to be partnering with you on this Transportation Heritage Trail improvement and to expand our trail system. So it's our pleasure to provide this, and it's every intention for us over the next several years to make every dollar that we raise come back to this project as well. So thank you very much.
Good evening, I'm Ryan Owens. I'm the Executive Director of the Monadnock Conservancy. I'm not a Keene resident, but our offices are right here in 15 Eagle Court in Keene. We're a land conservation trust that seeks to conserve the natural landscape of the greater Monadnock region and also to connect people as deeply and significantly as possible to the natural landscape. And Keene's incredible multiple-use bicycle and pedestrian path network is a huge part of that, and so we're happy to be a partner with the city and with Pathways in making that happen. This is the third such time that we've helped on a project, and we're looking forward to many more times, particularly with the Transportation Heritage Trail. So thank you.
Thank you. Questions from members of the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick clarifying question. I noticed in the agenda for Pathways of Keene, it in one spot references 40,000, another it's 30,000. Just hoping to get clarification on the amount of the donation for Pathways.
Yeah, Councillor Jones, or Andy, I guess you can speak to it, but we did indeed cut a check to Councillor Jones, and he sits on our board. And I was there the day that we cut the check at the rec center for, I believe, $40,000.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's correct in the recommendation. Sorry about that.
Members of the public? Seeing none, I'd like to get a motion.
Sure. Move to recommend that the city manager be authorized to do all things necessary to accept a donation of $40,000 from Pathways for Keene, Inc. and $12,000 from Monadnock Conservancy, and that the money be allocated for the Transportation Heritage Trail Phase 1 project.
And I second.
Further discussion by members of the committee? Seeing none, all in favor? No one opposed, unanimous. Thanks, Andy.
Welcome. I'm here again.
You are.
Another donation. So this one is for up to $35,000 from the Keene Rotary Club, and to be used for wayfinding for our trails and parks. In last year, actually it was 2021, that the city council adopted the UNH to Downtown to Trails study, which highlighted the need for additional wayfinding along our trails. And that was a pretty prominent piece of that particular study. And as a result of that, we had looking at various pieces of the CIP and have the program in there for the open trails. And then I had planned on that for another year, and working with the Keene Rotary Club, who's coming up on celebrating their international 100th year, and wanted to have some type of centenarian gift back to the city, very much like what the Lions Club did a few years ago. We went through various projects, and then this came forward, and they really liked the concept of having named trails piece, having the signage with the donated by underneath. And so this was kind of all coming together at the same time because we're doing our branding project. And so part of that branding project was wayfinding and signage. And so we had just received that piece and during these conversations, so I was able to show them what that would look like. And then they wholeheartedly agreed that this is going to be a great donation for our trails and our parks. So this would be signage that would indicate the name of the trail or the park and all the amenities that go in there, as well as mile markers along the trail. So this is a great opportunity for them, and as they have their logo of service to others, I think this provides a lot of service to our community and all the trail users. So I would like to thank them as well.
Questions, comments, members of the committee? Members of the public? Seeing none, it's your turn.
Move to recommend that the city manager be authorized to do all things necessary to accept a donation up to $35,000 from the Keene Rotary Club, and that the money is allocated for wayfinding for the trails and parks.
Second.
2 seconds. All right. Any, been moved and seconded? Any further discussion, members of the committee? That's me.
Thank you. I just want to point out that between our first item and our second item, that's $87,000 going into our local trail system. As a newly minted member of the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advocacy Committee, I think that's awesome. I'm really excited about the wayfinding project as well as our upcoming Transportation Heritage Trail project. So I think that these are going to do a lot to improve quality of life in town. So thank you to everyone involved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, ready for a vote? All in favor?
Thank you.
No one opposed, it's unanimous. Thanks, Andy. Captain Tenney.
Good evening. Steve Tenney from the Police Department. Tonight we have just one item in front of you. It's the acceptance of federal forfeiture monies. This resulted from 2 cases that we worked jointly with the Department of U.S. Homeland Security Investigations. The first case was actually an older case from 2015, and that case, the money in that is $4,129.17. The second case was from last year in July, and that was $9,267.80. So the total money for both cases is $13,396.97.
Thank you. Questions from members of the committee? Any members of the public? Others? Yes, sir.
David Crawford, Marlborough Street, Keene. I'm going to ask that the committee consider rejecting this money as the spoils of a failed war on drugs. It's a small amount of money compared to the statement that it would send to other communities, and I think many people can acknowledge that the war on drug is a failed war on drugs. So for those reasons, I would ask that it be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you. Other members of the public? Motion?
I just wanted to ask Mr. Crawford what he thought we should do with the money if we rejected it.
If the city doesn't accept it, I imagine, I really don't know. I guess it would go back to, I don't know what the course it would take from there. I presume it would go back to wherever it's coming from, I'm guessing, but, I think it'd be a great statement. But thank you.
All set.
Thank you.
Your turn.
I'd move to recommend the city manager be authorized to do all things necessary to accept federal forfeiture monies in the amount of $13,396.97.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Further discussion by members of the committee? Seeing none, all those in favor? Anyone opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a good
Steve.
evening.
Aaron Costa.
Good evening. Thank you. Aaron Costa, Assistant Public Works Director, Operations Manager of the Treatment Facilities, here tonight to discuss acceptance of a source water protection grant from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services in the amount of $14,200 to perform a property survey around the West Street well field. The city has utilized this grant in the past to install security fencing around its Court Street well facilities, as well as security fencing around its surface water location up in Roxbury. The West Street well is a valuable drinking water resource for the city of Keene. It's located on approximately 5 acres of city-owned property that abuts a horse farm. Recent farm activities are of concern within the 400-foot sanitary protective radius of the well. And these funds will be used to perform a detailed property survey of that city-owned parcel. And once completed, the city may decide to evaluate whether or not a fence is appropriate along that property boundary, all in an effort to protect that water source and comply with the New Hampshire rules in regards to the sanitary protective area. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions, members of the committee? Members of the public? Seeing none, a motion.
The Finance, Organization, and Personnel Committee moves to recommend that the city manager be authorized to do all things necessary to accept, execute, and expend a local source water protection grant from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services in the amount of $14,200 to perform a property survey around the West Street well field.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Further discussion, members of the committee? Seeing none, all in favor? No one's opposed, unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next item is we're taking off the more time agenda, and it's a discussion from Councilor Filio's recommendation concerning city charter amendment to the primary, municipal primary. Counselor.
Thank you, Randy Filio, Keene City Council. Yeah, as you can see, I wrote this letter a while ago. And basically, it was just to ask the city council to take a look at, previous primaries and to see if we should tweak the process, if we should eliminate the process, or just make recommendations. And obviously, we're talking to the city clerk about it, to see what would trigger a primary if we actually need it. I know a lot of other communities don't even have municipal primaries. So it's basically just asking the question, do we keep it? Do we keep it the same? Do we modify it? Now, obviously, no matter what we do, this goes to the voters. This isn't something the city council decides on. We're just making the recommendation, do we send it to the voters to make changes here? So, I want to make that clear. This isn't something that just happens through council. That's why it takes a while to get this to go through. It'd take a change of the city charter, which would have to go to the voters. So, I really don't have a strong opinion either way. It's just something that I thought should be brought up so we could take a look at it and see if it needs modifying or not. And with that, I'm sure the city clerk has a few things to say on this, and I'll sit down and be quiet for a minute or two. Thank you.
Thank you. The city clerk.
Actually, it's going to be a tag team between the attorney and I, and he is going to start it off. I'll do the middle, and he'll conclude.
I drew the short straw. So anyway, Patty's right. The two of us have been sort of looking at this since the letter was submitted. And as you know, one of the reasons we want to get by the past election and have some period of time to be able to consider this on its own. So what I'm going to, just a quick explanation for the committee and the public. Again, just sort of a little Civics 101 lesson about how the city works. The charter, for all intents and purposes, the city charter is the constitution of the city. It sort of serves that function. It lays out in it, a lot of responsibilities with respect to how the city operates. As Councilor Filio pointed out, it's not something that can be changed easily, and it's not something that should be changed lightly, just like the Constitution for the state of New Hampshire or the United States Constitution. And that, even with that, if we are going to make a charter amendment or a charter change or revision, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, there's a process to do that. What's being considered tonight is the conversation with respect to whether or not to change the charter provision, especially Section 11 dealing with the primaries. Some of you will remember that we did take a look at that section a number of years ago and made some changes to it. So that's what's being considered this evening to at least talk about. And the charter itself, even though it's the sort of the constitution for the city, as I said, it's still subject to both the review and approval for any changes that we would make by the state. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And the charter, even though it does set out it does set out processes with respect to the elections and that sort of thing, the city is also subject to various statutes that apply in that context, and we will talk about that as well. Patty is going to go forward now and talk to you about what's happening in some of the other cities and what other amendments that we've done to the charter at this point.
Thank you. Actually, I have quite a bit of research to share with you, and I apologize, but I'm going to need to really refer to my notes quite a bit. So I did a survey, 13 cities, so 9 cities do not have primaries at all. There's 4 cities that have very similar language to what we have, that there's a primary if it's triggered by a particular number of candidates for a particular office. So I'll go through those. So Nashua only as a primary if 2 or more candidates file for the office of mayor. And only the office of mayor triggers a primary in Nashua. In Manchester, if more than 2 candidates file for any elected office, or if more than 4 candidates file for any at-large office, a primary is held, and very clearly, if it's a ward office, the primary is only in the ward. If it's an at-large or the mayor's office, that primary is citywide. And different from Keene, that primary ballot only contains those offices where the number of candidates has triggered the primary. So it's like a mini ballot. So if it's a ward council seat in one of the particular wards in Manchester, it's a mini ballot with just that office, and it only goes to those voters in that ward. So different than the way we do it. In Laconia, similar to us, if more than 2 candidates file for the office of mayor or ward councilor, a primary is held. In the case of the mayor, again, citywide. In the case of a ward councilor, again, the primary election is only in that ward and only for that office. All other elected offices, moderators, selectmen, checklist supervisors, those automatically bypass a primary and go right to the general. In Keene, we did this change in 2011, so if more than 2 candidates file for the office of mayor, or 2 candidates file for the office of a ward councilor, or if more than 10 candidates file for at-large, a primary is held. Again, unlike the other cities, we have traditionally placed all candidates in all the offices on the primary ballot. I'm thinking we should rethink this. The other cities seem to go for these mini ballots that really would save us both money and sort of the record keeping that needs to occur after the election. So I've learned something new. So as I indicated, we changed our charter in 2011. Since then, we've always had a primary. Some office always triggers it. And it's usually, we've had at-large. In 2013, it was at-large. In 2015, it was actually all 3 races, mayor, ward, and an at-large seat trigger that primary. 2017, it was triggered by at-large. In 2019, it was triggered by a mayor and at-large. And 2021, it was the mayor's office that triggered it. So whether we, as the attorney indicated, whether we adjust the charter just a slightly or we eliminate the primary, it's a statutory process, very detailed, very time-sensitive. 7 days from this, you do that. 10 days from that, you do that. And it goes on for a few months like that. So the steps are, 1, we have to identify the necessary amendments. There's 7 references to the primary on our charter right now. The mayor needs to designate a committee to look at this. Now, it could either be the FOP committee or he could appoint an ad hoc committee. We've gone both ways over the years. The city attorney would need to actually draft the language for the ballot question. We'd have a public hearing. As the attorney indicated, that language is reviewed by the Secretary of State, the Department of Revenue Administration, and the Attorney General's office. They have to give approval. They're looking to see that our charter language does not conflict with any state statutes. And then once we sort of have the approval from the state, the city council actually has to direct me to place the ballot question before the voters. We vote on November 7th, and these changes will be effective January 1. So as indicated, it's a very tight time frame, and if the city council decides to go forward, and we got the next few months to decide if we want to do anything, the mayor would be establishing, and this would be our first statutory timeline, April 6th. So we have until April 6th to figure out if we're going to do something. And July 23rd would be the end of the city council's involvement, and that would be the date that you would direct me to place the question on the ballot. So in preparing for tonight's discussion, I was looking at the charter as it relates to this section, and specifically as it relates to this idea that 3 councilors, ward council seats, can actually trigger an election. And I started thinking, well, how's that supposed to really work? My focus has always been when do we don't have it, but when we do have it, boy, how is that supposed to work? So I went back to the 2011, it was an ad hoc committee. chaired by former Mayor Lane at that point. And I was seeing, well, what did they say about this? And they clearly saw that that would happen, and they said in their report that they anticipate that it is a citywide primary. But you know, I'm pretty doubtful, one, I didn't remember that, and I'm pretty doubtful that that sentence in their committee report really triggers anything for me, because I think if you need to say it, you need to be saying it in the charter, not some sort of background in a committee report. So we haven't had any specific example where this has actually occurred, so I've never really had to face this dilemma. But my inclination, again, would be unless the charter directs me, we're going for a ward-specific election. And I did speak to the clerks in both Nashua and Laconia, and they too have ward-specific elections for ward offices where the trigger is causing a primary. So we actually put that question to Bud Fitch. I just didn't want to sort of react to, here's what I think. Bud Fitch is a former Assistant Attorney General. He's now the legal counsel for the Secretary of State's office. He is so generous, so incredibly generous to answer all my queries over the years. Gave us a very detailed explanation, which a lot of it was a little over my head. So we'll be asking the attorney to sort of decipher what Attorney Fitch happened to tell us in response to that question. Also, you know, I looked at data, thinking, well, that's probably an important thing for you to know as well. And since we changed that trigger mechanism for our primary, if you look at the at-large races, the top 5 candidates in the primary are the identical top 5 candidates for the general. So there isn't really a lot of shifting that goes along. We certainly could narrow that field. Usually it's 1, at the most it's been 3, but it's very consistent. Top 5 primary, top 5 general. So I'm not certain our thinking is really panning out in reality. So, you know, there's benefits to a primary, and the one that you hear the most is it is the process for a write-in nomination to the general ballot. If you hit that number of qualified write-ins, and you can actually have your name placed on the November ballot. And probably the most significant example of this is 1999, when former Counselor-at-Large Mike Blastos accepted a write-in nomination for mayor, and he became our next mayor. So these things happen. It does happen a lot at the lower levels with selectmen positions, moderators, that kind of things. But certainly it can happen at the very highest office that we have. So that's sort of a pro to keeping a primary. But the con is there's an expense here. And for our last primary, it was over $10,600 for that process, which Councilor Filio would, I've heard him say, it eliminated one name. So that's sort of the flip side of the pro. But, you know, for those cities that provide for the possibility of a primary, 9 times out of 10, they're having a primary. Because at the very last minute, someone's going to walk in that door and file declarations. It happens time and time again. So if we had sort of a trigger clause and it was amended, if it was left up to at the sort of the race of the mayor, I expect that we would fairly be consistent, that we would have always a third candidate would pop in at the last minute and trigger that process. But, you know, I think what would be very problematic is if primaries become rare. Like, we skipped a few years, we didn't need a primary, then all of a sudden we need a primary. Because consistency is really important. It's consistency for voters to know what to expect in the fall, that we have a primary, we have a general. But it's really very important for our partners, the 5 polling facilities that allow us to have our elections. We get on the school's calendar way in advance, and with the anticipation that we're going to go there. So if we start skipping years, they're going to stop thinking about us, and I would really, really hate that at 4 weeks before an election and the filing period closes, and we realize we need to have a primary, and we don't have everything in place, and we don't have all the election workers with that date reserved on their calendar, we could find ourselves caught short, and that would be really unfortunate. Also, Keens election workers, boy, they're great about making sure they don't book personal commitments on election days. Very, very few, and they do it by accident, and oh, they feel so guilty that they've done that, they've scheduled a vacation, and they're gonna be gone. So, you know, consistency is really important for everybody. Finally, you know, election laws, boy, are they becoming complicated. Every year, it's just another wave of more requirements for the state, more reporting, more things they want us to sort of validate when we're interacting with a voter. And like anything, if someone does one thing that has a lot of steps, once a year, guarantee you're gonna have quite a little bit of a struggle before you hit your stride and you remember all of those steps. And that really concerns me, because the details in an election process, how small they are, boy, they can be, one, quite embarrassing, two, quite problematic for the city. And so the idea that, okay, we have a primary and it's a great opportunity to refresh everybody's recall of the steps on checking in a voter and handing out a ballot and all the reporting requirements we need to do at the end of the night. So, you know, I go back and forth, as you can tell. I go back and forth about whether we should have one, whether we shouldn't. Obviously, it's your choice, but I think definitely there's some issues with the at-large. I don't know if that's really worth that effort. The ward council, I think that's sort of maybe not worth that effort, because actually, I forgot to mention that if we had a ward council seat and we had an election in one single ward, I think that would be problematic. People would be quite confused. They would be showing up at polling locations wondering why we're not there. You know, so even though cities do it, I think traditionally they have done it and their voters have gotten quite accustomed to it, but it would be quite the change for us. So the last thing is, we are looking for significant changes in election laws and election processes and election technology over the next few years. Could hit us before this next presidential. It is that close. And so we need to try to keep everything as stable as we can so that we can make sure that we can really fulfill our obligations of very accurate and very trustworthy elections. So having a primary, having a little refresher for our workers, that's always a good thing, especially when we have some new technology that's going to come our way. So with that, the attorney's going to speak about how to decipher Attorney Fitch's guidance to us on election law changes.
Well, deciphering something that Patty knows, even the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office sometimes scratches their head over and goes, it will be a little bit of a trick. But there do seem to be some basic understandings about the process and what we can and can't do. There is some case law justification, came out in 1969, for the idea that cities have a fair amount of control over their election process, and in particular, sort of the primary election process, about how they want to do that. State law does specifically give to the cities and towns, the right to conduct their elections. State law also, once it says you can have your election and you can have your primary, state law requires that we follow the state statutes with respect to the pre-election procedures that happen, how you set up a polling place and, how you let voters in and out and prepare the materials, and the election procedures themselves, what happens when people actually come to the polls. We are specifically required to incorporate those two areas of state law. But otherwise, the state statutes are, as we pointed out, fairly silent on the question of what you can do with the primary process. Now, one of the advantages that we have if we are going to make a charter amendment here is that the amendment process, quite frankly, is easier than a charter revision process. I haven't been through a charter revision process since I've been here, would rather not. It is a much more complicated process, requires a commission. Once you open up the charter to a revision process, and basically what that means is you're going to change your form of government somehow. So the amendment process is easier. to go forward and do. Now, when we looked at some of the questions that came up with respect to how or whether to change it, this question about a single ward counselor did occur. Patty contacted me on the phone, and we looked at Section 11, and I think the intent was not to have a primary if there were 3 challengers in a ward, but the way Section 11 reads now, that would not be the case. So, basically, I said to Patty, well, gee, each ward's a town under state law. Can you have it just in that town? Whether that's a good idea or not is another question. But Bud Fitch does agree, and apparently some other towns, other cities do this. If you only have that one ward that's having a contest, then you could do it in that one ward. But as Patty points out, that raises all kinds of other questions with respect to whether you wanted to do that or not. The other question that came up was, if you have more than the 10 candidates, let's say you have 15 at-large candidates for the 10 positions, you could say on the ballot, vote for no more than 10 in this context, and then you would pick. And state law does allow for that and I'm going to talk in a minute about the difference between majority and plurality votes, but state law does allow for that. The problem with doing that, though, is you really start, if you have quite a number of candidates, and you should pick a threshold, you dilute the votes with respect to all of the other candidates that are running, because people get to pick among more folks in that kind of context. So you may have a situation where you have a ward councilor who really doesn't have a lot of support, but got a plurality of the votes. Remembering that the difference between a majority and a plurality is in a majority contest, you have to get 50 plus 1 to be elected. But in a plurality contest, if you have 3 candidates, the candidate that has the most votes but doesn't have 50 plus 1 of the votes and the percentage, that person gets elected. So you have the possibility in a situation like that to have candidates that were elected without that kind of support within the electorate itself. So, but you could do it. And then, finally, the question with respect to majority and plurality, one of the questions that came up was, could we do a runoff? If you did the election without a primary and you had 3 candidates for mayor and none of them got a majority, could you do a runoff after that point? And the answer we got from the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office is pretty clear. No, you don't have the statutory authority to do that. So, if we eliminated the primary for the position of mayor in particular, and we did have that situation where you had 3 or more candidates, you have to consider the fact that you may have a mayor in the city who does not have that kind of majority support. So the question becomes at that point, what kind of mandate may they have or not have with respect to operating within the city. So those are things that are really important to consider going forward as to whether or not you want to actually change it at this point. I think that's about it for me.
I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to, at some point, talk about the recommendation, because we would like to get some direction from the full
You
council.
do have a motion in front of you, and we talked about that a little bit, about how to proceed on it. Quite frankly, I think Patty and I would really like to have the sense of the council as to whether or not you even want to go down this road at this point. Because it will be, and I'm not saying this just because, look, I don't want to do the work, but it will be a lot of work for us to do. So we really do want to have some direction from the council, which is why the motion is not titled as sort of put it on more time and allow us to keep digging. It really is to get a determination from the council that they do want the city clerk and by extension me to pursue this and bring back a solid recommendation to the council for a primary change.
Patty, I just have a question. You talked about the last, I'm not sure, but I think it was the last primary. It was 10,600. Wasn't that unusually high, like in the past? It was like half that?
I was surprised at that number, too. I remember it being about 6,000, but that's
Yeah.
what inflation does over time. So it's all the same components. It's nothing new there. It's printing of ballots, it's coding of the memory card, it's, there is a rental fee in one of our facilities, so that is somewhat new, but it's nominal, and it's payroll. So it used to be 6,000, now it's 10,600.
And then my other question is it safe to assume that if that's the price for the primary, that's similar to what the price would be for the general
Yes,
election?
it is.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks.
I don't see, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at my screen, but don't see in here where in the charter it prevents us, and I think you were referencing this, from doing just a single ward if that was all that triggered in what's currently written. I don't see anywhere where it references that it must be a citywide or must be all those. I don't know if that was same interpretation that you guys had or if that's different.
You know, I guess I never really, one, we haven't had the instance that it's a ward council seat that would make me sort of, well, I don't know how this is supposed to work. So embarrassingly so, I've never really thought about it until I sat down and read the charter yesterday.
Fair, and my personal feeling is I'm tempted, my position is that I'm not interested in making a change. We actually, Councilor Giacomo got onto council originally through Right-On, so even more recently than Mayor Vlastos. And Chris Roberts was through Right-On as well. So it happens a lot, especially at the council level. So I personally am tempted to leave it alone. I do like the idea of the mayor's position having mandate and having 51% of the vote, or 50 plus 1% of the vote. So that's my personal opinion. I'm tempted to push this as informational, but I don't know, as opposed to authorize and investigate the feasibility. But that's my personal preference, so.
Thank you, just one more time. Now you see where I wrote the letter last year. And honestly, like I said, for me, it's like I wanted to bring the question up because there's a lot of unanswered questions. I don't have this is the way that I would like to see it. Quite honestly, in my opinion is, we have the best city clerk in the state, and if she recommends it, I'm all behind it. There's nobody that knows election laws and how to run an election better than our city clerk. But obviously, this needed to be brought up because we're having questions being brought up tonight that, I hadn't thought about and what other communities are doing. So, whether we change it or whether we stay the same, at least we should stay updated on this. And whether you change it tonight or not, we should still be taking a look at this because, as the city attorney said, especially with the legislatures that have been going up there, election laws change year after year. So we really need to stay on this and, maybe just automatically trigger this every year and take a look at it to see. Because once again, this isn't something that we vote on. We let the voters vote on this. So, we should take a look at that and we should talk to our constituents and, ask them more about primaries and do they think, that they're worthwhile? Would they like to see them? But once again, whatever our city clerk goes with, I'm happy with that. And between her and the city attorney, they keep us out of trouble, so I'm good.
Also, Jay Kahn was a write-in, and then he won, and he was like the highest vote getter ever. So another example. But I'm thinking, leaning towards Councilor Remy's idea of informational, and if we wanted to revisit it, and you talk about some huge changes that are occurring, that are coming down from the state within the next 3 years, like wait to revisit it after those changes shake out. That would be my recommendation, if you wanted to revisit it, Counselor.
I must say I agree with Councilors Chadbourne and Remy. I'm not saying no, just not right now. Now's not the time. City staff is pretty overworked right now from what I've seen. This is a fairly substantial undertaking, and with a lot of efforts going on, both nationally and at the State House, to restrict voting rights and to disenfranchise some voters, I'm very reluctant to remove any opportunities for the citizens of the city to vote. So I'm also leaning towards this being informational. Yeah,
I think I'm leaning the same way as well. I think I heard one one real positive, which would be the financial aspect of it, really, and quite a few negatives of, potentially removing some write-in opportunities, which are quite prevalent here in our community, as well as, the confusion of, do I have a primary or not? That a level of consistency is certainly is worth having around. So I think I agree with the committee that maybe an informational motion may make sense. If the full city council decides otherwise, they can make that amendment then, but I think that makes sense.
So I think we're prudent. Thanks, Randy, for bringing it up. I think maybe a lot of people, when they go to ballot, they never even think about what it's costing. But the price of democracy is well worth whatever it is. It is a little bit cumbersome, but that's come about over time for other reasons, not because we've made it that way here in the city of Keene. And it's a great place to meet other people, so we're going to take that away. Some of us are going to be disappointed. I kind of agree. I think we've done our due diligence, taking a look at this, and no sense stringing everybody along. Well, put it on more time, or let's get a vote. Whose turn is it? So, just so I know. Oh, okay. You get the message? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, anything else before we look for a motion? Motion, please.
I do just want to thank the city staff for all the work they've done in researching this. So I'll move to recommend that we adopt the letter as informational.
And I second.
Accept.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion up here?
I would also just second Councilor Filio's comments about our city clerk.
Thank you.
You've always left me very impressed, and, perhaps it's fate, but, we are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. $10,000 is somewhat of a cheap price to pay for the right to vote, considering the price they're paying right now.
All in favor? Anyone opposed? Unanimous.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thank you.
All right, next item is personnel systems. Must be you.
It is me. Good evening. Elizabeth Fox, Assistant City Manager, HR Director. I am here this evening with amendments to a couple of sections of City Code for the, seeking the committee's recommendation to adopt for the full council. They're fairly straightforward amendments. The first amendment is to the City Code relative to family and medical leave policy. Currently, our code only allows for family and medical leave for the purposes of birth, placement, or bonding of a child to be taken in a continuous period, which is the minimum requirement of the federal law. The federal law does allow the employer to grant it on a reduced leave or a non-continuous period, but our procedures do not. The proposal before you will allow that process, allow consideration of reduced leave or non-continuous leave for a period of time following the birth of a child. So it's expected to give employees more flexibility as they deal with balancing new obligations in their household. In addition to the language, adding this additional use of the leave, there's some definitions so that we can all know what we're talking about when we deal with it. So that's the first amendment to City Code. The next two amendments have to do with the medical insurance provisions, and we're in two components. The first addresses the payment in lieu of taking our health benefit that we provide non-union employees. We're seeking to adjust the amount. It has not been adjusted in at least 10 years. Actually, I can say at least 11 because I've been with the city 11 years, and I know it hasn't changed in that time period. And the goal here really is to keep these employees in parity with the union employees and the amounts provided those. And then the final amendment has to do with the formula that we use for calculating premium for employees entitled to insurance under the Affordable Care Act, because the Affordable Care Act has a variety of provisions. It has a different methodology for calculating employee insurance share. And we're looking to retain the attractiveness of our qualified part-time employee positions and proposing that we reduce slightly the employee contribution towards premium when they are eligible as a qualified part-time employee. So those are the three changes in a short nutshell, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first one, do we know what the cost of going from 9 to 7 is for the qualified part-time?
It ranges because it's based on the employee's income, so it's anywhere from between $12 and $20 a week for the employee.
I just mean,
And we
I
have
don't know how-
five employees that are covered, so it's not substantive. I didn't do the full math. So it's probably about $5,000, I'd say less than $5,000 annually for the employees that are currently electing that option.
Okay.
I just appreciate this minor change, making it more gender neutral, where it said his and you changed it to employees. Like, that's a step in being more forward-thinking, given the changes in our society.
Yeah. Mike, I think.
Last one, the medical insurance, the credit, that's, at least from my perspective, from private sector, that's incredibly unusual to incentivize someone to not be on the insurance.
It is not unusual in the public sector at all, and so we in the public sector are competing in for a different pool of employees or in a different market expectation.
Okay.
To the extent that people have to have insurance, that is our primary interest, frankly. We aren't trying to incentivize them to not have insurance if they're a regular full-time employee, but to the extent that they might have another option, and we can encourage them to make a fiscal evaluation as to which option is best for them, it, I think, benefits the city.
But you can't, can you opt out and not have any insurance?
You
have to
can, you will
prove that
not,
somebody-
you will have to, you have to prove that
Right.
you have coverage.
Yeah.
We will, that frankly is very important to us. We want our employees to be well cared for. We want them to have access to care when they need it. So,
Other questions?
What's the per person cost to have a person on our insurance?
the cost for a single plan coverage for the city is approximately $9,500. So,
Okay, thank you.
All right. You get a motion?
Move to recommend the adoption of ordinance O 2023-03.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Further discussion, members of the committee? Seeing none, all in favor? No one's opposed, unanimous. Mr. Engineer,
Good evening, Mr. Chair. How are we tonight?
wonderful. And yourself?
Fantastic.
It's a nice night out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Don Lucier, City Engineer. Tonight, my item is unusual in that I'm actually talking about money coming in rather than money that I need for a project. So this is related to Senate Bill 401 that was passed last year by the state legislature. It appropriated, I believe that the total for the state was $36 million for additional bridge aid to municipalities. We recently received these funds from the state. The city's portion of that total ended up being almost $250,000, $724,612 altogether. And that kind of reflects the fact that the city is, after DOT itself, we're the largest owner of municipal bridges in the state. We have more bridges than anyone else besides DOT. The way that the funds were distributed, it was based on a formula based on the population of the city, municipality, and also 50% of it was based on the area of bridges that the municipality is required to maintain. So we have a pretty good portion of it. Not a lot of strings attached with this money, except that the funds are restricted to use on the maintenance, construction, or reconstruction, maintenance, construction, or reconstruction of municipally owned bridges. So it's not a lot of strings, but it does have to be earmarked specifically for bridges. So in the interest of efficiency, the resolution that's on the table tonight does a couple of things. It asks the city council to accept that money in the first place, but then also provides some recommendations on where we think it should be appropriated. We are suggesting a couple of different things to be done with this. The first item is related to the George Street Bridge project. That project is scheduled for construction in '24. The funds that were set aside by the city and the budget that we've established was based on an estimate that was done by DOT staff in 2009. They did include a factor for inflation over time, but based on what we saw for the construction cost of the Roxbury Street Bridge project, that inflation adjustment that was included in the state's budget really hasn't kept up with the actual inflation over that period of time. Based on what we saw for that Roxbury Street project, we think that the project is going to be pretty well underfunded. So we are suggesting that you also, in addition to accepting the money, appropriate an additional $175,000 into the George Street Bridge project. The next item is the Sullivan Road Bridge. This is a very small bridge, actually doesn't even meet the state definition for bridge, which is a minimum of 10-foot span. We consider it a box bridge. It was damaged in 2021 as part of those real heavy July rainstorms that we got. It was included in the state's damage assessment that was submitted to FEMA for reimbursement. We're still, believe it or not, going through that process of getting the FEMA money from that. But we are expecting that the damage to that bridge will be included as a FEMA reimbursable expense. That funding typically is, I want to say, maybe 25%, 75% is the typical FEMA reimbursement. For this emergency, there was a special authorization, and they were expecting it to be reimbursed at 90%. So the recommendation is to appropriate $125,000 for the repair or reconstruction of that bridge. That would allow us to fund a total project cost of about $1.25 million, and we think that that'll be sufficient for that project. The balance of the funds that we received, which comes to $424,612, we're recommending that be appropriated into the Bridge Capital Reserve to fund future bridge maintenance needs.
Thank you. Questions, members of the committee? Seeing none, we'll take a motion.
Just to clarify, and I'm sure that this is the case, but it caught my attention when you were talking about the definition of the bridge under state law. So because this is a municipally owned bridge, it's still eligible for the funding, the Sullivan Road Bridge?
So the language in there, in the act says on the maintenance, construction, or reconstruction of municipally owned bridges, the replacement bridge is going to have to be a more than 10-foot span.
Oh.
It's going to be a bridge. So construction qualifies, and we know that simply because the existing opening wouldn't satisfy DES requirements for a culvert crossing.
Great, thank you. Yep.
What body of water is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Sullivan Road Bridge over Ferry Brook. It's as you Sullivan Road north of Route 9 on that side of Sullivan Road. Just before you get to where Ferrybrook Road branches off to the left, you pass over a little bridge. It's not much to look at today, but it does need some work.
Move to recommend the adoption of Resolution R 2023-07.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Further discussion, members of the committee? Seeing none, all those in favor? No one's opposed, it's unanimous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I may, not relevant to this committee, but I do want to put a plug in on February 14th, next Tuesday. We are going to be having a neighborhood informational meeting for the George Street Bridge replacement. It's going to be held at the rec center, so we hope folks are listening at home and come out to hear about the bridge project.
Thank you.
I can't think of anything more romantic for Valentine's Day.
Sorry. You know, in my line of work, that gets us hot and steamy, so. The time, oh, boy, I believe it's 6 PM, but you can check your local DPW press releases to confirm.
Maybe next year, a meeting at the sewage treatment plant.
All right, let's get, our next favorite guy, the assessor.
Hey, good evening. Thank you for saving the best for last. I appreciate it. So tonight I have two resolutions before you, R 2023-08 and R 2023-09. They both deal with two veterans credits that the city offers. Just as a quick reminder, a credit is a direct deduction in the tax bill. In this case here, the veterans credits are worth $300 apiece. A veteran can only qualify for one or the other, not both. The difference is the optional veterans credit is for veterans who served during a wartime, and the all veterans credit is ones who didn't serve during a wartime. There's a few years, I think probably back in the 50s, where the United States wasn't considered part of the war. So typically we review all of our credits and exemptions all at once. We do this every 5 years. The city council has decided to do this as part of their fiscal policies. We do this to coincide with our revaluation because that's a time when we're seeing changes in assessed values and maybe a tax shift at the same time. So we look at them all together. The reason why we're here tonight looking at these is because there's been a legislative change, and any time there's a change in the legislation, the state statutes regarding these credits, we have to readopt them. So what they changed is the definition of a veteran in this case. So typically, in the past, a veteran was defined as someone who has served and has been honorably discharged. Now it's expanding that definition to someone who has served a minimum of 4 years and continues to serve. So now we have veterans who maybe been actively on duty for 10 years and they're continuing to be on that in duty. As long as it's still, they meet the rest of the definition, it's their primary place of abode, this is their residency, they can now qualify for this credit as well. So this expansion is going into effect. What we have to do is readopt it in order to continue to offer the credits that the city has chosen, which is the $300. If we don't, what happens is we go down to the standard credit, which is $50. That's certainly not my recommendation, and I don't think would be the council's as well. With that, I can answer any questions you may have.
Questions?
So my understanding is that the minimum amount of service time is 4 years, and they must have been honorably discharged. What about for veterans who have been medically discharged before the 4 years, such as those who are wounded in combat?
Yep. So it's the 4 years if you're continuing to serve. If you've been discharged prior to that, it's 90 days of active duty. So as long as you've been honorably discharged with 90 days of active duty, you would qualify as a veteran. In this case, it's 4+ years and continuing to serve that you would now qualify.
Thank you.
Other questions? Take a motion, please.
The Finance, Organization, and Personnel Committee moves to recommend the adoption of Resolution R-2023-8. And question, are we voting on them separately? Okay.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further questions? Seeing none, all those in favor? No one's opposed, that's unanimous.
The Finance Organization and Personnel Committee, move to recommend the adoption of Resolution R-2023-09.
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor? No one's opposed, it's unanimous. Thank you. I guess we're adjourned. Thank you very much.